We'll help you, or shoot you. It's episode 66 of NES Works. Data East is back, except not really. This week's lead game comes to us from Data East in the US, but in truth, the release in question, Kid Niki Radical Ninja, hails originally from Irem. We've seen a few Irem games already in the form of the quirky shooter Scoon and the diabolical Deadly Towers. And Kid Niki definitely feels Irem-like. It's fast-paced, challenging, and has enough charm to compensate for its underwhelming visuals. It's also, along with Ninja Kid from Tosei and Bandai, one of the few NES games so far to wear its Japanese origins on its sleeve. Not that Kid Niki wears sleeves, he's far too radical for that, my friends. Of course, no discussion of this game would be complete without a little eye-rolling at its title. While the actual contents of the game show no particular effort to have been Americanized, this is after all a game about a ninja, so things like shoji screens, golden Buddha statues, and music composed in minor thirds are only fitting. The title is a pretty liberal reinterpretation of the name it shipped under on Famicom. Nothing about that title, Kaiketsu Yanchamaru, or The Wonderful Yanchamaru, speaks to the extremely 80s American slang that's been thrust upon this game in localization.
Chevy Nova?
There is an undeniable lack of surfer dudes or whatever here. In his Japanese version, Yanchamaru looks straight up like Goku from Dragon Ball. But as we'll see in NES Works 1988, even Dragon Ball couldn't make it to the US as Dragon Ball in the 80s. There's no way the off-brand version was gonna fly. And so, Kid Niki, the Radical Ninja. The whole radical thing is just marketing. Despite the 80s surfer slang plastered across the US packaging, Kid Niki is a straight-up romp through Japanese history and mythology. The bosses include a Buddhist monk who bombards you with Japanese kanji, a Yuki Onna-looking witch, and a kabuki warrior. Despite his spiky do, Niki's rat tail hairstyle is a pretty traditional Japanese look too. It's hard to say how many kids bought this game expecting something with a funky 80s pop culture vibe only to be bombarded with vintage Japanese culture, and how many kids might have been pleasantly surprised to encounter something a little more offbeat than the packaging suggested. But the clash between names and themes notwithstanding, Kid Niki is a pretty solid port of a fairly obscure arcade title. Aside from some visual downgrades, Tosei and Irem managed to keep most of the content intact across versions. Some enemies have less complex behavior patterns than in the coin-op, and the NES game has more generous checkpoints, but otherwise this is pretty much a faithful adaptation of an arcade title, something that had already become a bit of a rarity by this point in the NES's life. Given its origins, Kid Niki is a simple, straightforward game at heart. The protagonist runs and jumps, moving left to right. There's no backtracking as the game uses Super Mario-style ratchet scrolling. There are a few items hidden throughout the stages, including power-ups that allow you to toss weapons temporarily, and you can climb trees to take out monsters in the foliage. For the most part though, it's a simple left-to-right jog that's every bit as straightforward as it looks. Enemies attack from all sides, and often from above, and you fend them off by swinging a whirling blade that spins so quickly it resembles a cross. This sounds kind of violent, but Kid Niki is really a lighthearted game where frogs breathe fire and enemy ninja wear Haniwa-inspired masks reminiscent of the Shy Guys you'll see in the upcoming Super Mario Bros. 2. When you kill a foe, it flies comically off the screen. The first boss's name is Death Breath. Bosses often turn into cartoonish skeletons when defeated. And the monk boss screams "Fool!" at you, complete with a sampled voice. It is very goofy. The action moves quickly and enemies attack relentlessly, but even though it's pretty tough, it rarely feels unfair. This is a precision and pattern-based game, but the controls are responsive, and most ambiguity within the collision detection works in the player's favor. The bosses can be pretty challenging. They fill a big chunk of the screen and crowd poor Niki. They can only be injured when you hit their weakness, and they have an annoying tendency to knock Niki's weapon out of his hands. Striking a boss typically means your sword's going to go flying across the screen, forcing you to retrieve it while dodging the boss, its attacks, and any minions it summons. It works both ways though. One of the bosses also loses his weapon when you attack, which adds a fun dynamic to that encounter. There are only a few places where the action feels unfairly punitive. The fourth stage, where you have to leap gaps from which fatal bubbles float skyward in a fairly chaotic pattern, is more tedious than fun. And the final stage, in which you escape the enemy palace via rooftops while engaging in a running battle with the evil stone wizard, is neat in concept but feels utterly miserable in action. The boss's attacks are unpredictable, and you have to dodge more of those floating bubbles in between encounters. And you have to do it all in one go, without being able to count on mid-stage checkpoints. Kid Niki's not the most amazing game on NES, but even though it feels much simpler than the exploratory action games we've seen so much of here in 1987, that's not a bad thing. Deep games that you can sink your teeth into are great, yes. Yet there's nothing wrong with a brisk, shallow diversion from time to time. Developers have begun to elect to rework arcade games to accommodate the NES's limitations, but this is a case where nothing much really needed to be tweaked. Kid Niki carried over pretty respectably from arcade to NES, unlike, say, Spy Hunter or Ring King. Nice work, Data East. Our second game this episode is equally decent, if unremarkable, Gotcha the Sport. It's hard to imagine anyone electing to spend any time with this game today, but despite being a bit of a nothing of a release, it does at least have an interesting story behind it. According to an interview with Shoichi Yoshikawa at the Game Developers Research Institute, Gotcha was developed by a studio called Sanritsu, or possibly one of its spin-offs. Sanritsu was one of those workaday developers of the 80s, largely known for creating forgotten arcade games and producing arcade ports for Sega consoles. With Gotcha, Sanritsu appears to have been working under contract for Atlus, a fresh-faced Japanese studio that would experience its first minor breakout hit on Famicom around the same time as Gotcha's US exclusive release, a dungeon crawl role-playing game called Digital Devil Monogatari, MEGAMITENSEI. Gotcha is a long way from the demonic MEGAMITENSEI, but maybe that's why Atlus offloaded it to Sanritsu. Atlus in turn looks to have been hired to create Gotcha by a fresh-faced American studio called LJN. This is one of several games Atlus would create, or at least subcontract for LJN. While LJN was new to video games, the company itself had been around since the early 1970s as a toy manufacturer. Gotcha would be LJN's first video game release, which is a little ironic in that it's also closely tied to the company's demise. A big part of LJN's business was built around a label called Entertech, a sub-brand focused on toy guns. Entertech's guns didn't look like Nerf or Super Soaker pistols like we see today. They were shockingly lifelike, modeled after real hunting and military weaponry. The Gotcha brand was a major new initiative for LJN, a cross-marketing tie-in between a toy line and a video game. This wasn't unprecedented. Sega's Zillion for Master System was based on a light gun toy with its own two-season anime tie-in. And in America, 1986 had seen the launch of the Laser Tag Academy cartoon as a branding exercise for World of Wonder's Laser Tag light gun toy. Gotcha took a similar tack for a similar product. Unlike Zillion and Laser Tag though, Gotcha was a paintball gun. Also, instead of launching Gotcha alongside a promotional cartoon, LJN actually based the brand on a somewhat obscure 1985 spy flick in which a semi-pro paintball sport called Gotcha factored vaguely into the plot. It's right around here that the wheels begin to fly off this endeavor. LJN clearly didn't have a firm focus on who their target market for this product actually was, since the movie Gotcha had had enough sex and violence to become one of the very first movies ever given the newly minted PG-13 rating. Anyway, the main promotional tie-in for the toy was an NES game, which at the time was seen very much as a kids-only market. Not that the toy or game had anything in particular to do with the film. Where the movie took place largely in Europe, the game is set in anonymous woods, and the Arctic, and the Bronx. Well, the missing piece of this puzzle was that LJN had recently been acquired by MCA, as in MCA Universal, as in Universal Pictures, the company that had produced and distributed Gotcha the movie. So this would be an early example of a phenomenon we'll see throughout the NES era, in which films geared toward older audiences are given kid-friendly tie-ins. Gotcha is hardly as egregious in this regard as Die Hard or RoboCop, that's for sure, but it is another NES first represented by Gotcha. Anyway, the game wasn't especially amazing, but that's hardly the worst thing about Gotcha. No, the real killer here is that LJN's initial run of the toys ended up shipping defective, forcing a massive recall. The company had pinned its hopes on the success of Gotcha, but instead of becoming a major force in the toy and games world, LJN ended up falling into financial ruin. Even as LJN entered the NES market as one of the very first US licensees for the platform, which should have been an easy road to incalculable riches, the entire company instead collapsed. MCA quickly dismantled and sold off LJN, an echo of the Warner Atari disaster that had devastated the US console industry and opened the door for Nintendo to come in strong with the NES in the early 80s. LJN's games division was then acquired by the other US-based licensee that existed for NES in 1987, Acclaim. Nothing good would come of this. But really, the writing was probably on the wall for LJN and Intertech anyway. Even if Gotcha hadn't self-destructed, it's hard to see a future in which the business could have carried on as usual beyond 1987. The Gotcha toy line launched right as the American government at all levels began to crack down on realistic-looking toy guns. Police kept killing children who were wielding toy guns, which created a nationwide outrage. It would obviously be unrealistic to expect the police to ask questions first and shoot later when threatened by small children, so the solution everyone settled on instead was to make toy guns look more toy-like. Wild designs and eye-searing colors became the standard, including here on NES, where the Zapper light gun was reissued with its dark gray plastics remolded in neon orange. The Zapper had already reflected some of the socially conscious trend of creating unrealistic toy guns from the start. The Famicom equivalent of the Zapper had been a fairly convincing 6-shooter that shipped with wild gunmen, whereas the NES gun was a little more futuristic looking as a laser pistol. When rendered in orange, there was little question that the Zapper was no threat to our boys in blue, unless they wanted to face off against Marty McFly in a high-score contest, that is. So, sea changes were in store for Intertech and LJN in any case. The failure of the Gotcha toy line simply accelerated and upgraded those changes, causing LJN to become a secondary label for Acclaim to use as a way to work around Nintendo of America's annual third-party license limitations. And of course, there's one final first for Gotcha the Sport on NES. It's the first third-party release in the US to make use of the Zapper light gun. We actually haven't seen any Zapper games in a year and a half since the arrival of GUMSHOE at the tail end of Nintendo's first-party launch rollout for the console. While there have been other peripheral-based games over the course of 1987, those vintage gray Zappers have been collecting dust for a while. Gotcha is nowhere near as good as Nintendo's own light gun games, but one can imagine that its arrival came as a bit of a relief to early NES adopters who wanted something to shoot at besides ducks and banditos. It's also notable for being the first Zapper game to require use of both the gun and a controller. The goal of each round of Gotcha is to reach the opponent's flag, claim it, and return it to your base before either running out of time or an enemy player manages to tote your flag to their own base. You use the D-pad on the controller to scroll left and right, while relying on the gun to hit opponents with paintballs before they can shoot you and cause you to lose precious time. Cases of paintball ammo appear on the ground and being carried by opponents, and shooting either one will refill your ammunition. It's quite reminiscent of the scrolling mode in Hogan's Alley, except that here you have full control over the screen movement. You can even backtrack if an enemy manages to sneak your flag past you. Unfortunately, there are only 3 environments here that cycle endlessly, and 3 difficulty settings that simply reduce the timer and make enemies more aggressive. It's a decent enough gun shooter for 1987, and in some ways it feels like an early draft of Namco's magnificent Time Crisis series, but it's ultimately forgettable. Though definitely a lot stronger than most of LJN's future output. Next time on NES Works, more games from LJN and Atlas.